Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, welcome to the last class of the third week, and it's really nice meeting all of you once again on this forum. This class is going to be slightly different. In other words, we are introducing a new element to the class. So far we've had some interactive sessions. You've also heard a couple of learners expressing their ideas, their opinions on literature. You've heard me speak in this forum. Today we are going to introduce the element of quiz as a matter of reflecting. Let's go for some kind of recalling of some important concepts and types of poetry, origins of poetry. We have had a very good discussion on all these concepts this week. So, this time we are going to recall some of the important components using quiz. Here, of course, please keep your pens and papers ready, but do not panic, because this is not going to be a part of your graded assignment. You can just sit, relax and watch it just like you watch any other class, or if you wish to be a little more proactive, you can keep a pen and a paper ready, and as and when a question is asked, you can jot down your answer and then later compare it with the answer being displayed here. That is all. We are just recollecting what we have learned over this week. Therefore, relax, enjoy. If you are ready, we can begin with your first question. Are you ready? Maybe you get about 20 seconds or 30 seconds. So, there might be a pause of about 15-20 seconds. By that time you can jot down the answer, and after that pause you will get the answer. The screen would display the answers for you. Okay? So, here comes your first question, comparatively easier. All right. So, here is a lovely stanza or a poem, you can call it. Can you identify the type of poem this is? We discussed it earlier, recall it. For your understanding, you can read this poem aloud and see what kind of effect it creates. We have already said this, that a poem comes alive only at the magical touch of your voice. Therefore, please read it aloud and see if you can spot the type of poetry it is. I need a front door for my hall. The replacement I bought was too tall, so I hacked it and chopped it and carefully lopped it, and now the dumb thing is too small. Well, how do you identify what type of poetry it is? Of course, try to see the rhyme pattern. You have learned how to give or mark the rhyming scheme here, the rhyme scheme, and see what it does. Here comes the answer in case you haven't got it, or if you have already got it, here is the answer. It's a limerick. A limerick is a short poem, generally of 5 lines, and towards the end you get it tickles your funny bone. We have already said that. So, it's a limerick. If you have got it as a limerick, you are absolutely right. Let us move on to the next question. So, here is your second question. How does a good limerick end? This should be easier, right, because it's not really a coincidence that you had a question on limerick earlier, and now if you have been watchful, you will have seen how that limerick has ended. I am not asking you how that particular ended, I am asking you generally how does a limerick end. We discussed it in our earlier classes. Do you think you can recall? All right, Most of you may have got it correctly, or even almost all of you will have got it correctly. Here is the answer. A limerick generally ends with a witty punchline. Even in the limericks that we studied in the previous class, you will have seen how the last line gives you a kind of a kick, a kind of a punch. Therefore, if your answer is a kind of a punch line or a hit line or a kick line, something like that, you are absolutely right. We are not, it's not that we expect you to get each and every phrase correctly. If you, as long as you've identified the meaning here. So, whatever words you have used, as long as the meaning is similar, you are right, you are absolutely right. Okay. Here goes your next question. So, I hope you are ready. Yeah, with a witty punch line, that is right. So, here comes your next question. So, this is what we discussed during our class on origins of poetry, probably the second class on tracing the source of poetry. So, I do not need to give you this clue, it belongs to the Indian origin of poetry. So, do you think you can spot that work, that treatise in Sanskrit that discusses the theories of poetry, the first work of poetics, we can call it, broadly speaking, The answer is Natya Shastra by Bharata. This is considered as the first work of poetics that deals with poetry, drama and things like that. So, I am sure you must have got this answer correct, but even if you haven't, no problem, do not fret. So, deliberately in this quiz we have introduced a couple of questions where we may not have discussed those things. So, through this method you also get to know, in case we have not discussed any of those concepts, no problem, it is an opportunity for us to learn. So, you can just note it down. So, you can as well expect a couple of questions that we may not have discussed in the class, a few of them of course, maybe something like less than 20% of these questions can surprise you, but nothing to worry, you can just jot down the answer and learn it. Okay. Are you ready for the next question? All right, here is your next question. What are the three broad types of poetry? This I am sure all of you will answer correctly, because this is one of the easiest questions here, and if you have heard the lectures properly, and I am sure you have heard them properly, so you would be able to answer them. The three broad types of poetry, we discussed this while remember we discussed this, though poetry defies to be classified into neat boxes, into neat categories. For the purpose of convenience, we categorize poetry into three broad types. So, what are they? Well, the answer comes here. You have lyric poetry, narrative poetry and descriptive poetry. These are broad categories, of course, depending on how you classify, but in the class we discussed these are broad categories, right? In the class we discuss them as broad categories. Okay, right. So, let us move on to the next question. Odes and epics, we have discussed them as types of poetry, subtypes of poetry or subgenres of poetry. So, one of the distinguishing features of odes and epics, they have an elevated tone and a lofty diction, of course, because of the content, because of the theme, right. So, to which broad type of poetry do these belong to, these subtypes of poetry? Where do you place? In fact, in the previous slide we discussed three broad types of poetry. Can you place to which broad type these subtypes belong to, odes and epics? You can think. All right, even if you do not get it properly, not an issue, but please make an attempt, just see. Okay, here goes the answer to that. They belong to the narrative type of poetry, narrative poetry. And if you can even recall, can you please recall the stone tablet? Do you remember where we used it? If you have guessed the Epic of Gilgamesh, well, you are absolutely probably right. Okay, yeah, all right. Here comes your next question. What do you understand by enjambment? What do you understand by enjambment? If I can give you a clue, it is related to indirectly, of course, stanza. So, it is a part of stanza in some way or the other. See if you can spot enjambment and define what it means. Do you need 5 more seconds, or do you want me to display it? All right, okay, here comes the answer for enjambment. Well, an enjambment is a poetic technique, wherein when the poet wants to convey an idea or his or her theme, then and if it cannot be contained in a single line, then it moves on even to the next line. In other words, when you come towards the end of the line, it does not end there, there is a spilling over effect. You have to therefore read the next line without any pause. Therefore, you can call it a run on line or an incomplete sentence at the end of a sentence, and it does not have any punctuation marks. It does not have a comma, it does not have a full stop, but you will have to. So, in the absence of these punctuation marks, you will have to read them continuously. This is one of the mistakes many of us make when we are reading poetry. We think that the moment we come towards the end of the line, we pause, though there is no need for pausing, but we need to move continuously read it. Say something like this. It's a well known poem by E. Cummings. I carry your heart with me, I carry it in my heart. Look at this. Though my heart begins on the next line, you will have to say it continuously, because otherwise you would be breaking its meaning, you would be breaking its structure. So, I am never without it. Anywhere I go, you go, my dear, and whatever is done by only me is your doing, my darling. So, the entire stanza is enjambed, you can say that, because there is no punctuation towards the end of it. So, I carry your heart with me, I carry it in, that is the title of the poem, that is enjambment. All right. Okay. So, let us go towards the next question. Okay. Here comes your next question. This is related to elegy. Okay. In elegy, how does one mourn over somebody who is deceased? In other words, how does the poet develop the theme of mourning? Can you recall? In fact, if I can give you clues, there are 3 stages through which an elegy is constructed, is built. So, can you identify the 3 stages in elegiac convention? What are those 3 stages? All right, here comes the answer for this. The first stage is grief, the second stage is praising the person who is no longer there, and the third stage is consoling yourself, coming to terms with grief. We discussed this when discussing the subtype of elegy. We said the first part deals with, though they are not confined to stanzas, it is not that first 2 stanzas, it is nothing like that, but generally speaking, an elegy is developed through these stages. The first part generally deals with grief, and the second part eulogizing the person who is no longer there, and the third part is coming to terms with the sad aspect of life, What is that sad aspect? That death is inevitable, death is a companion of life, therefore you must accept it and then try to move on. So, that these are the 3 stages through which elegy is developed. Okay. All right, let us move on to the next question. So, this is slightly challenging. This may be challenging for you because I do not think we have discussed it, but it is a general term. I am sure you will have heard this term somewhere or the other. License to deviate from conventional rules of language and grammar in poetry is called, poets have an extraordinary leeway when it comes to using language, right. You will have seen some strange expressions, sometimes even some strange spellings, not conventional spellings, and even grammatically speaking some half sentences, unconventional abbreviations and all these things. Do you know the term that is used to denote all these things? We call it, the answer is there in the question itself. A part of the answer is there in the question. The answer to this is poetic license. Poetic license is a term we use for the kind of liberties the poet takes vis-a-vis language, grammar, convention and other things. All right, good. How many questions have we completed so far? I am sure we must have completed about 10 of them. So far, how is the progress? Are you able to enjoy all these questions and answers? Well, if you enjoy, we can continue this kind of quiz even at a later stage, right, because it is an extraordinary way of course, quizzes can be, customized quizzes can aid teachers in very many ways. Therefore, it can be a very interesting pedagogical tool. Quiz can be a very interesting pedagogical tool, and if you enjoy this activity, I am sure we can continue it even in subsequent weeks. All right, let us move ahead and see some more questions here. Okay. Yeah, here goes your next question. Even this one I am not very sure I have discussed or not. I might have mentioned maybe while discussing ballads, or I might have mentioned. Nevertheless, let us also consider this as a kind of a challenging question. Okay. Do you think you can name a collection of ballads that has had an extraordinary influence on English Romantic movement? In other words, this collection of ballads inaugurates English Romantic movement, or you can say it can act as a kind of a political manifesto for a new poetry movement in English literature. Can you identify this collection of ballads? Well, since it is Romanticism, and if you have made a wild guess if it has got anything to do with Wordsworth, well, you can't be wrong, right. You are absolutely closer to the answer. This collection is by Wordsworth and his friend Coleridge, and here comes the collection. It is called Lyrical Ballads, 1798, the first publication, Lyrical Ballads, 1798. So, it inaugurates, in other words, it fortifies, it acts as a political, a poetic manifesto for English Romantic movement, in literature. Okay, yeah. So, here is another easy question. Now, after a challenging question, of course, we need to go a bit slow, right? Easy. All right. So, this we have clearly discussed, while discussing sonnets, we discussed different types of sonnets. So, how do you distinguish Shakespearean sonnet from Petrarchan sonnet? How do you distinguish Shakespearean sonnet from Petrarchan sonnet? Of course, both have 14 lines, right. The difference is, if I can give you a clue at this stage, in the way the stanzas are structured, in the lengths of the stanzas, and even in the rhyme scheme, that is the difference. So, let us go and check what this difference is. Okay. In the Petrarchan sonnet, you have two stanzas. The first stanza has 8 lines and the second stanza has 6 lines. So, you can call the 8 line stanza an octave and a 6 line stanza sestet. So, 2 stanzas, the first stanza is an octave and the second one is a sestet, and generally the rhyme scheme is ABBA, ABBA, that is the octave, and when it comes to sestet, CDE, CDE, or CD, CD, CD. I mean, even that is quite possible. There are 2 variations here, either it is CDE, CDE or CD, CD, CD. And in Shakespearean sonnet, it has 3 quatrains. Well, a quatrain is a stanza of 4 lines, right. So, therefore, you have 3 quatrains and a couplet at the end. Shakespearean sonnet ends with a couplet, and the rhyme scheme is ABAB, CD, CD, EF, EF and GG, right. I am sure all of you must have got it correct. Okay. So, next question can be slightly challenging. The purpose of the quiz, of course, while we have already discussed this, right, while testing how well you have listened to all the lectures, also it is meant to see, if you have had some wide and general reading as far as poetry is concerned. And do not worry, it is not a graded quiz. So, even if you do not get it right, absolutely no problem. Go ahead and enjoy this quiz and see if you get it right, and definitely you will not lose anything for guessing it wrong. So, just try, make an attempt. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Look at the kind of confidence with which the statement declares or places poets as the unacknowledged legislators of the world. This statement presupposes that by virtue of their engagement, poetic engagement, by virtue of their concern with poetry, poets have an extraordinary ability to exert moral power and create some kind of an order. That is why they can be called unacknowledged legislators of the world. And who says it? Well, it is of course Shelley in his defense of poetry. Again, Shelley is, you can call him a younger colleague of Wordsworth, or the second or third generation of romantic poets, if you can consider romantic poetry to have begun with Blake, then the third one. Otherwise, we can simply call him a romantic poet, a fellow romantic poet. Forget about first, second, third generations, but he is a romantic poet, a very well known romantic poet. Yeah. Let us go on to the next question. This is another very interesting question, and I am sure an easier one. All of you can get it. Can you identify the rhyme scheme and the stanza type here? Well, remember we said that even based on the number of lines in a stanza, you can call them by a particular name. Do you think you can identify that? We have just now discussed it. In fact, if you have been attentive even during this class, I am sure we have answered this question. So, do you think you can identify the rhyme scheme? And to identify rhyme scheme, you just have to check the last word and the last sound: fanned, land, atmosphere, near. So, the rhyme scheme you must have already guessed, A, B, A, B, and because it has 4 lines, what do you call a 4-line unit? You can call it a quatrain, and because it has AB, you can call it an alternating quatrain, because the sound A comes, after which B comes, after which again A comes, then B comes, therefore you can call it an alternating quatrain. I am sure you must have got this correctly. Now comes the next question. So, this should also be easier, alright. Okay. How many lines and in how many stanzas, how many lines are there in a villanelle and how many stanzas are there in a villanelle? Slightly, you can ignore a bit of confusion in the question. The question asks you how many lines are there in a villanelle and how many lines are there and how many stanzas are there in a villanelle. A villanelle, if we can quickly recall, is a type of poetry that has its origins during the Renaissance in Italy. So, it is an Italian form which is now there all over the globe. So, and we discussed even an extraordinary poem in the class that illustrates villanelle and its rules. Well, a villanelle has 19 lines. Okay. A villanelle has 19 lines, and it's a combination of tercets and a quatrain. So, in 19 lines you have 5 tercets. In other words, tercet is a 3-line stanza. So, you have 5 3-line stanzas, 5 3s are 15, and a quatrain, 4 lines towards the end. So, it makes it 19 lines and 5 plus 1 stanza. You can call it a 6 stanzas totally, but of differing length. Okay. Which poetic form used liberally during the Middle Ages is also used as a mnemonic tool? It is a very, very important one. If you recall, earlier we said that especially during the Middle Ages and even a little earlier, people used poetry as a means of memorizing something. In fact, if they wanted to pass on something from generation to generation or from person to person, from tribe to tribe, they used poetry as a means for transmitting that. So, in order to aid somebody's memory, in order to abet memory, so they used poetry. So, that is mnemonic tool. Can you identify that form of poetry, that type of poetry? Well, if your answer is acrostic, you are absolutely right. Acrostic is a form of poetry wherein it's helpful in order to memorize something. If you recall, I even said that the first letters in an acrostic is very, very important, because the first letter of all the lines together constitutes either the title of the poem, or it can even reveal the name of the poet or the patron or the saint or the goddess, anybody, that it's an acrostic, but a popular method used during the medieval times. Okay. So, I have one more question, or maybe 2 more probably, and then we can end this class. Okay. What is a poetic form that does not follow any strict poetic rules or any formal structure? I said that it has its origins recently. It's of recent origin, modernist times, 1910, 1920s, modernist period. Can you identify that poetic form? We said, right, this particular poetic form does not have any strict rule. In other words, a poet has a total control over its structure, any number of stanzas, any number of lines in stanzas, any rhyme scheme, anything at all, right? Yeah, can you identify it? Right, you are absolutely right. It is free verse, or in French it is called vers libre, free verse or vers libre. All right, I am sure you want to go for maybe one more. Let's see. Okay, we have the last question of this class. Dash, we have used a dash here. What is the most crucial element in visual poetry? We read a couple of interesting visual poems, right? We began with Lewis Carroll's an excerpt from Alice in Wonderland, and then we read another visual poetry, and during that I said in visual poetry this is the most crucial element, more than the meaning, more than the meaning that words exude. This particular feature is a very, very important one. Okay, the answer is the way it is designed, typographic effects, because we said that here you arrange words, spaces, everything in such a way that you bring out that particular object, you bring out that particular object. So, the way you align your words, the way you create your words to evoke that image becomes important. That typographical effects, they become very important. They play a major role in visual poetry, also called concrete poetry, shape poetry. It goes by many number of names. I am sure you enjoyed this activity. It's really fun, and of course I said right in the very beginning that it's not going to be graded, in the sense we are not going to consider your scores here. Therefore, it's a way of recalling important things we learned during this week, and also one or two new things that we may have missed out earlier, and we may have that you may have picked up by now. So, this is something very important. I am glad that through this method we could recall most of the things that we discussed during the class, and also one or two features, new features, and I am sure you enjoyed this activity. So, in the next class next week we come out with more interesting features, more interesting classes. Until then, take care. Okay, bye bye. Thank you.